Take a splash of paranoia, a dollop of mistrust, and mix them together with a shed load of body horror, and you've got The Thing, a video game I was rather excited to play until this monstrous bit of voice acting kicked things off. Watching both become a midnight snack for this leggy specimen at least provided some catharsis after a decidedly rocky first 15 seconds. The Thing is a sequel to John Carpenter's 1982 cinematic masterpiece, also called The Thing, a film I highly recommend you seek out before watching any more of this video because there will be spoilers throughout. A prequel also hit the silver screen in 2011, inexplicably also called The Thing. The 1982 edition is a must-watch, one of my two favourite horror films alongside The Shining. The more recent entry is decent enough, but don't go into it expecting fireworks. Both films and the game all follow the same basic storyline. A group of scientists, or Marines, or Norwegians are in Antarctica, and they're being hunted by an alien which crash-landed on Earth thousands of years ago. Not only is it able to take many revolting forms, seething masses of legs and tentacles, hideous amalgamations of the many life forms it's assimilated, it's also able to near-perfectly mimic any living creature it gets its hands on. Anyone could be the Thing, and you'd never have a clue. It's an amazing premise I hoped would work brilliantly in video game form, and it does occasionally threaten to do so, but there's also a lot of dreck to contend with. That's right from the game's outset too. The Thing's first level is an absolute nightmare, but for all the wrong reasons, to the extent I almost gave up mere minutes in. You play as Captain J.F. Blake, the leader of a team sent to investigate what happened at Outpost 31, the camp featured in the original film, while a second looks into events at a nearby Norwegian camp, the setting of the prequel. It quickly becomes clear developer Computer Artworks perhaps got a tad carried away with their use of tutorial messages when the first tutorial message is a message explaining the tutorials. As soon as you close it, you get another one outlining the cold exposure mechanic. Basically, if you stand around outside for too long, you'll eventually lose health, before a third appears explaining how objectives work. And then you're finally able to play the game. A ridiculous concept, I know. After roughly 7 seconds of movement, you're stopped in your tracks again for a brief introduction to the different types of squad mates you'll be working alongside.
Blake, you need anything repaired or even a simple bypass and I'm your man.
If any of you take on any damage, get back to me ASAP and I'll help you out. I'm not carrying any dead bodies back.
I'm locked, loaded, and ready to make shit dead.
Followed by another pop-up which explains that different types of soldiers love wearing certain styles of hat. Next, a message explaining trust levels, followed by a second after fixing a junction box. Then there's 15 more seconds of running and another pop-up about how to open a locked door, shockingly with a key. After a minute or so's gameplay, you find what you need and return to the locked door, to be greeted by 2 more tutorial messages. The team then makes a grisly discovery, there's another pop-up, followed by one more final hint before you're able to head back outside to finish the level. This section took me 6 minutes to complete, including cutscenes, and included 12 tutorial messages. That's one every 30 seconds, and their outrageous presence makes the Thing's opening nigh on intolerable. Little did I realise prior to starting the game that rather than a terrifying shape-shifting alien being the biggest hurdle I would have to initially overcome, it would instead be walls of text. Once you've navigated the Thing's intensely dull beginning, seriously, it's one of the worst I've ever played. Longer stretches of gameplay thankfully become the norm, giving you time and space to get immersed without constantly being interrupted. The first third of the game, other than those early stages just spoken of, is really rather promising. There are several solid callbacks to the original movie. You pass by the hut Blair was imprisoned in and can visit the hollow below where he was building a new spaceship, and you can also find Macready's recording.
I'm gonna hide this tape when I'm finished. If none of us make it, at least there'll be some kind of a record. The storm's been hitting us pretty hard now for 48 hours. We still have nothing to go on. One other thing. I think it rips through your clothes when it takes you over. Windows found some shredded long johns, but the name tag was missing. They could be anybody's. We're all very tired. There's nothing else I can do. Just wait. R.J. Macready, helicopter pilot, U.S. Outpost North 31.
Although it's not the original rendition voiced by Kurt Russell, I'd assume due to licensing issues. Frozen in place, bottle of whiskey by his side, you'll also find Childs, one of two who survived to the end of the 1982 film along with Macready, who is nowhere to be seen.
Whitley, this is Blake.
What have you got?
One body, identification says Childs, no survivors.
It doesn't answer the question, was Childs the thing? We know the alien is able to survive extended periods in the ice, and so it may have chosen to sit and wait to be discovered while still in human form, but it at least gives us some indication of how events played out. The body of the Norwegian scientist who chose to end his life is also on display when you later visit their camp, with a few other more subtle references dotted around here and there, such as the loading screen using the same assimilation graphic as the one on Blair's computer. There is also an absolute whopper of a revelation I've not revealed yet, which we'll get to later. Along with the multitude of references to the 1982 film, several mechanics are introduced that are the perfect accompaniment to the themes of mistrust, paranoia and uncertainty so prevalent throughout the series. What really set the thing apart from its contemporaries back in 2001 was its combination of squad management and the trust and fear mechanics. Frequently during your travels, you'll come across survivors who will tag along for the ride. Soldiers provide the most effective firepower and get least stressed under pressure. Engineers can repair certain junction boxes Blake is unable to fix and are reasonably good at keeping it together, and medics are able to heal you and your team but are also cowards. Irrespective of class, they're all crack shots too, which is greatly appreciated during some of the game's more hectic moments. If you heal them when they're injured, give them weapons to defend themselves with, or kill enemies in front of them, you'll gain their trust and they'll be much more likely to follow your orders. If you accidentally shoot them, refuse to get involved in combat, or take their weapons and ammo away, they'll become more and more suspicious of you to the point they may believe you to be the thing and attack. They'll also get frightened by spine-tingling sounds, scenes of bloodshed, and the thing itself, and you can calm them down by giving them weapons, ammo, or an adrenaline hypo, or by guiding them away from an unsettling area. Those you're unable or unwilling to help will begin to have a meltdown, refusing to follow instructions, and sometimes even ending their own life. You can tell when one of them is on the brink by bringing up your squad menu. They'll be looking around frantically, or by the very obvious audio-visual cues, such as them vomiting or anxiously rabbiting away.
Oh man, we're gonna die here!
Oh, we're gonna die here.
It should be noted that there were one or two situations I found myself in where it almost seemed impossible to stop them losing their marbles, but usually there was still a solution, such as here where I managed to nudge an engineer away from a particularly disturbing room. Once you figure out exactly how trust and fear levels can be effectively managed, which isn't overly difficult given much of it is explained, some impression of humanity is lost as the systems become mostly about managing a pair of meters, but regardless they still add much needed depth to what would otherwise be a bog standard, very clunky third-person shooter. The Thing is a franchise which at its core asks a simple question: how much do you really know about those around you? You might think someone is a good person, only to eventually realise that outer shell is naught but a facade, an inviting exterior concealing an inner darkness. In order for that revelation to be most effective, no matter if it's the discovery of a metaphorical monster or in the case of The Thing, a more literal one, you need to be at least somewhat familiar with the person in question. The trust and fear mechanics are designed to create a bond of sorts between you and the rest of your squad, which in turn hopefully makes the moment one of them turns from ally to abomination all the more impactful. Whether computer artworks achieves their goal is ultimately going to be down to how much you're able to ignore the systems which underpin the mechanics. In 2001, I'd wager that was easier to do due to them being quite unique. In the present, where complex relationships between NPCs are more common, perhaps not so much. Personally, I think they work well enough, fit the game's tone, and were a bold inclusion considering how difficult I'd imagine they were to implement. It all becomes a bit transparent past a certain point, but I really admire the inventiveness on display. I said The Thing could be anyone and you'd have no clue, however that isn't strictly true thanks to the inclusion of blood test hypos. You can use them on yourself to reassure those around you that you've not been turned, or use them on your squad mates to check if they're hiding a horrifying secret. If they are, they'll immediately transform and begin their assault. It's another excellent idea, which in principle had the potential to be something truly special. Unfortunately though, it ends up being a complete bust. After travelling to the Norwegian camp for the game's second level, you find Pierce, the other squad leader, who doesn't trust you one bit, having witnessed the majority of his team falling to The Thing. Before he's willing to speak to you, he sends you out to retrieve a few tests so you can prove that you are still you.
Hold it.
Pierce, it's Blake. It's okay. Put your weapon down.
No way. You're infected just like all the others.
I'm not.
Your word ain't shit, Captain. I found a report that says the only way to prove you're not one of those things is through a blood test. Now, there's a medical kit near the kennel. You go get it and come back here, and I'll watch you do the test.
Blake takes one and is fine. Your two squad mates, on the other hand, don't fare anywhere near as well. It's an entertaining set piece, although you can see what's about to happen from a mile off. The problem is that before it even took place, I'd already discovered how broken the mechanic is. If you test both of your allies within mere millimeters of where the fight breaks out, a place where there are no things present and where there is no possibility of infection, their tests will be a-okay. Walk forward a couple of steps, trigger the cinematic, and they'll transform regardless. The rest of your time with the game doesn't inspire any further confidence. Most survivors you pick up during your travels will turn at set points during the story no matter what you do, and will sometimes transform a lot earlier depending on their level of exposure to enemies. It's entirely possible that multiple times throughout the game you'll test someone and find them to be healthy, only for them to turn very soon after anyway. If you do even the quickest of tests once the mechanic becomes available, you'll realise it cannot be trusted, and thus it becomes mostly redundant. During my playthroughs, I assumed most of my mates would turn sooner or later, and so blood tests became useless, an item I used extremely rarely and only on myself to boost others' trust levels in me. What a shame that is too, as there are glimpses of how it could have been used regularly to great effect. Later in the day, you enter a lab and witness a face-off firsthand.
Where's Cohen? I thought he was with you.
No, he went to the medical supply area to pick up more antibiotics.
And you let him go alone? What the hell are you thinking?
Oh, relax. The area's secure.
Secure? Are you crazy? Those things are everywhere.
Then why don't you go find him?
No, I think I'm gonna stay right here.
Both men's trust levels are low, but there are health kits nearby to heal them, and you'll likely have surplus weapons, so you can get them on your side if you complete the necessary steps. There's also a single blood test to pick up too. If you paid attention to the dialogue, you might choose to check the guy who was apparently gone for some time, and if you do, you are rewarded, in a sense, as it turns out he is indeed a thing. It's a structured take on what is otherwise a messy concept, and it was, for me, one of the mechanic's rare highlights. I mentioned earlier that the first third of the game shows a lot of promise, and that's because you haven't yet had time to properly figure out how everything works. There are lots of links to the film, and the game has the same inhospitable, ominous setting. The trust and fear mechanics make those you're with feel like living, breathing people, and the blood tests give you the opportunity to act on any suspicions you might have. During my time with the thing, I made sure to keep asking myself the question, how well does the game capture the essence of the film upon which it's based? In the ways I've just outlined, for a short period towards the start, I have to say it captures it beautifully. Unfortunately, that early promise is itself a cunning disguise, with proceedings becoming a more twisted, malformed merger of strange design choices and questionable story beats the further you progress. Whether you're putting down recently assimilated friends or beating back an extraordinary number of regular enemies, you'll quickly get sick of combat which feels awkward, clumsy, and completely out of place. For all its blood, guts and gore, John Carpenter's The Thing was a delicate cocktail of quiet uncertainty and visceral bursts of horror, and so you might have expected similar from the game, perhaps something akin to Resident Evil but even slower, exploration of a singular environment combined with infrequent battles with the Thing. There are shades of Capcom's zombie classic. You have to search for keys, codes or items needed to progress, you need to solve the odd puzzle within areas comprised of multiple rooms, and save points are fixed locations mostly housed in safe rooms, but that's where the comparison ends. The Thing goes full throttle from its second chapter onwards, throwing waves of nasties both large and small at you whenever the opportunity arises, barely minutes passing without there being a massive shootout of some description. You could choose a 10-minute stretch from the game almost at random, and I can guarantee you it will almost certainly contain more action than the entirety of its 1982 predecessor. Skirmishes also unfold across heavily segmented areas, with most levels lasting no more than 30 minutes or so. Often your companions will stay behind, leaving you alone for the next. That isn't always the case though, and jumps between location are common and confusing. After finding Pierce, for example, you head outside and then suddenly he disappears without explanation and you find yourself in a completely different area.
Pierce! Pierce!
God damn it. Pierce must have got lost behind me somewhere.
It is not survival horror, but rather action horror, and choosing to go in a more bombastic direction was not the correct choice tonally. Along with a familiar lineup of weapons, including a pistol, machine gun, shotgun, and sniper rifle, you will usually be equipped with a blowtorch and flamethrower for setting your foes alight. When facing smaller enemies, guns will do the trick, but taking advantage of that extra firepower is vital when facing bigger creatures. To put them down permanently, you must first blast them until your crosshair turns red, then douse them with flames until they eventually succumb to the heat. I started out playing the PlayStation 2 version of the thing, footage of which you're seeing right now, before I remembered there was a PC version which I immediately transitioned to. The irritating side effect of that was that on PC I couldn't get the damage indicator to function alongside mouse look, and so I had to sort of guess when a monster had taken enough damage that they were ready to be burned. Even with that hindrance though, the Switch was more than worth it, as using a controller was terrible. There are a few different types of creature for you to take down, and I think Computer Artworks envisaged you using different strategies for each, but I never found that necessary. Instead, I had just two approaches. For any type of scuttler, these beasties comprised of heads and legs, and by the way, where is the thing finding so many heads to create these things? You need to stand your ground and then back off as they begin to get closer. For any larger monster, circle strafing around them, shooting, then flamethrowing was usually enough that I'd only get hit once or not at all, as they'd often struggle to make contact. Whenever I did take damage, it was mostly due to problems with the controls rather than my aggressors doing anything of note. You can also hold down a button to aim from a first-person perspective and can even peek around corners. It's not particularly useful against the thing, given its tendency to charge straight at you no matter the form it takes, but against the human enemies who become prevalent during the game's final third, it's effective to the point many encounters with them border on becoming trivial. There are 4 boss fights too, and most are dreadful. For one thing, there's nowhere near as much differentiation between them as there should have been. In a game featuring a shape-shifting alien who can take on an endless number of ghastly forms, the idea it always defaults to a huge tentacle as it grows is desperately disappointing. First, you fight a tentacle dead ahead of you, while a hidden nest spawns scuttlers to harass you and a smaller tentacle continually attempts to whip you. The boss isn't too dangerous in and of itself, but having regular enemies harass you while you fight one, in this game or any other, is a cheap move which doesn't pay off 99% of the time. Next, you take on another tentacle in one of the most unwieldy arenas I've ever come across. If you repair the junction box ahead of you and then round a corner to see where the boss is, you can activate a switch which electrocutes it so you can get a few free hits in. Except it is stunned for only a couple of seconds, and with aiming being a joke, that leaves you with absolutely no time to attack whatsoever. You'll likely get hit a couple of times in the process and be forced to retreat, at which point you'll get stuck on a weird bump in the floor and likely get whacked again. I ended up standing back and spamming grenades through a gap in some boxes for the majority of the fight, blowing myself up a few more times than I cared to admit during my attempts, as it's not easy to do, and eventually, after many tries, I did manage to move past one of the worst boss fights I've ever played. There's no hiding the third time, as the tentacle is positioned in the middle of the room, and it will slap the daylights out of you no matter how quickly you move around it. After again failing multiple times, I realised sitting directly underneath it and firing upwards meant it couldn't hit me much, so I sat there doing that for a few minutes, topping up my health as needed until it finally died. The problem, however, wasn't really the boss, but the section right after it, where parts of the environment explode as you escape, with there seemingly being no way to avoid taking damage. I had but a sliver of health left and no health packs, with none around to stock up on, and so I ended up having to cheat, giving myself infinite health until I made it through. Am I proud of what I did? No. Did it stop me having a complete mental breakdown? Abso-bloody-lutely. Tentacle number 4 is more of a formality, as you're in a helicopter and don't need to do much beyond shooting its weak point for a minute or two. It's uninspired, sure, but it had the net positive of not making me want to smash my keyboard and mouse with a hammer, which is something, I guess. It's never a great sign when the meat of your title, in this case combat, isn't up to snuff. Beyond being forced to set enemies alight to finish them off, the one thing at least somewhat in keeping with the spirit of the original film, it's fairly awful all round. That is sad in a way, as in addition to the big non-combat features, squad management and blood testing, there are also lots of smaller things on display I mostly rather like, which could have easily been improved as part of a sequel. The cold mechanic, for example, adds an extra element of danger, meaning you never feel safe while inside due to the thing, or outside due to the temperature. It never blossoms into a fully fleshed out concept though, mostly just adding urgency to certain treks, and it would have been so easy to build on the idea in a sequel. Imagine if you were sometimes given the choice between indoor and outdoor routes through a level. If you chose to head out into the cold, you'd meet less creatures but need to think much faster to avoid freezing to death, while the indoor path would certainly be warmer, but you'd have a lot more enemies to contend with to compensate. It's a similar story with the fire extinguishers you can find. They're used predominantly to allow you access to burning rooms and to prevent the spread of fire every so often, but I never came close to running out of them, and so didn't really have to think about when and when not to use them. Making them a less abundant item and forcing you to choose more carefully which locations you clear of flames would have been a great way of adding an element of strategy to their use in a sequel. By the by, on the subject of fire, no one will ever convince me that computer artworks weren't at minimum being extraordinarily mischievous with the way they sometimes use it. In this kitchen, it's very easy to be burned to death as flames quickly spread around you. This faulty junction box is designed to draw you in before the same happens, and here it's very easy to die if you don't quickly realise you need to sprint away from the fire before it engulfs several hallways. Every so often, I'd even lose health simply by being close to it, even if it looked like it wasn't touching me whatsoever. That could be mildly infuriating, to put it politely. Codes for doors sometimes being written on something somewhere in the environment, such as here where you need to use a camera to find one, I did not expect.
Oh, there it is.
In addition, there's the odd brain teaser which hits the sweet spot in terms of difficulty, which isn't always a given. To rescue a particular scientist, you have to use security cameras to figure out how to open up a path for him without freeing the creatures locked in many of the surrounding rooms. Unfortunately though, it can be difficult to figure out what you actually need to do at times, as the thing's excessive tutorialization only applies to its first level or two. On several occasions I wasn't sure where to go or what to do, with a lack of signposting, environmental or otherwise, making progression slower than it perhaps should have been. For all the inappropriate action, the failed blood test system, the ridiculously tough bosses, and the quite schizophrenic design in general, there remains one aspect of the game which upset me more than all of them combined: the thing's story. I hate it, oh lordy do I hate it, to the extent that even though many claim it is 100% canon to the franchise, I refuse to acknowledge it. In fairness, the veracity of those statements I'm unsure of. I've read that John Carpenter gave his blessing to the game, I've read that he endorsed it, and I've read that he has outright stated it is canon. Despite several searches, I've been unable to find much in the way of a direct quote confirming anything, but given the character Sean Faraday looks identical to him and is voiced by him, I think it's safe to say he was involved in some capacity. Similar to much of the rest of the game, the story starts out just fine. Blake investigates the American camp and is ordered to destroy it using C4 by the commander of the operation, R.C. Whitley. Meeting Pierce at the Norwegian camp, the pair then head out to re-establish communications, but Blake loses track of Pierce, although he soon manages to find him right as he decides to end his life due to infection. All good so far. From here on out though, the story goes completely off the rails at astonishing pace. Blake enters Pyron, a secret facility below the Norwegian camp, where he learns that a company named Gen Inc. has been experimenting on the thing, with research led by the aforementioned Dr. Faraday. Although the facility has already been mostly overrun, Blake is able to rescue Faraday before the pair make their escape. However, Whitley suddenly appears from nowhere and knocks Blake out with a tranquilizer gun.
Right now, we need to have you both tested.
What the hell are you talking about? I'm not infected. My men are dying out there. I've seen firsthand what this infection is capable of.
Oh, you have no idea what it can do.
You son of a bitch!
I thought you were smarter than that.
Waking in another research facility named Strata, Blake learns that he is resistant to infection by the thing, hence him not being turned despite near constant contact with it, and that the government has been working with Gen Inc. to develop a weaponized form of the alien, the Cloud Virus. It turns out that Whitley has infected himself with the Cloud Virus with the hope of curing his terminal cancer. He also plans to unleash the virus on the general population, using planes to dump it on the unsuspecting civilians below, but Blake puts paid to that using C4 to destroy the fleet. And that's where I'm going to pause the recap briefly. Before we reach the thing's climax, I want to pause for a moment and talk about the reason I nearly never even made it past this point in the story. I give to you what is likely the worst level I've played in probably the last decade or so. After destroying the planes, Blake drops down a hole and finds himself in some underground caverns. Everything's okay at first. You kill some big things and some small things and deal with a few critters while crawling through a vent, which is unwieldy but manageable. Then you drop down into this absolute horror show. First, a potential ally runs past you and you have to act immediately if you want him to accompany you.
Get me a weapon!
Letting him run off alone to the top of the area is a death sentence, as even if you're quick to go save him, he'll turn and you'll have to kill him. The only way to save him is to equip him with a weapon as he goes by, and then follow him to fight off the scuttlers which appear. It is incredibly harsh, as I see no way most will be able to react rapidly enough to take the correct course of action. Whether you find yourself alone or end up with a mate, what follows is so bad. Soldiers follow up from behind, so you need to deal with them sharpish, but switching to an advantageous position is difficult as pipes constantly shoot out steam which only stop for the briefest periods and take a lot of health off if they hit you. That will probably happen several times, as they are an obstacle throughout this entire section no matter which direction you head, and the action often becomes so fast paced that it's extremely easy to lose track of where they are and when to safely move past them. Moving downwards, you also have to contend with turrets at regular intervals. The first couple are fine, as nearby explosive barrels can be used to destroy them, but after that you'll have to use the thing's wonky aiming to blow them up. That would be fine if not for the seemingly limitless amount of scuttlers that spawn from a pair of bodies further down, joined by one of the dog-looking creatures which can close the gap between you and it in an instant. And remember, you can't just safely back off, as the steam will get you when you least expect it. Moving down one level is hard enough, and you will regularly die trying to do so, but navigating 4 separate encounters I found to be practically impossible. After many attempts and a few tears, I finally made it to the bottom and left the area. I was in a bit of a rush to be past it, like many others I'm sure, which meant I didn't spot the turrets at the end of the next room, which promptly shot me to bits. The best part? There are no checkpoints during this section, so if you die, which you will many times, you end up right back where you started, in the caves. You're still not out of the woods once you've cleared the first room with the turrets at the bottom either, with more of them still to conquer. This part alone could take another few attempts, but fortunately there is a save room after the first 2 which takes some of the pressure off. The section prior to the turret rooms, the bulk of the experience, takes everything atrocious about the thing and adds a smattering of bad design choices you've no doubt hated whenever they've appeared in other games. A narrow environment where you face fast-moving enemies, an NPC you can only save under very specific circumstances, unforgiving environmental hazards that are ludicrously punishing, monsters which respawn endlessly in front and behind you, a final room you've no way of knowing will be filled with turrets which will kill you in an instant as soon as you enter, and no checkpoints. Even reminiscing and writing about it now, I can feel a deep sense of despair bubble up from somewhere deep inside of me. Again, I am in no way exaggerating when I say it's one of the most miserable levels I've ever had the displeasure of playing in any video game. Shaking like a leaf, my morale at an all-time low, I did eventually make it through, so let's get back to the story. With the plane destroyed and soul-destroying level concluded, Blake continues to work his way through a Gen Inc. facility on the hunt for Whitley. The base begins to fall apart, but Blake narrowly escapes to the surface, where he has to run through a snowy gauntlet of soldiers. By the by, that part is a horrible way to end things gameplay-wise. Blake finds Whitley, and Whitley reveals his plan, impressively while on fire.
Your pathetic sabotage of the consignment at the airstrip only delayed the inevitable. There is an evac team on its way to this location. Once I take the chopper, I will begin global infection. Game over?
And after a few more forgettable firefights with soldiers, Whitley transforms into a gigantic beast, the cloud virus, or perhaps the thing itself consuming him. Luckily for Blake, a helicopter complete with mounted machine gun arrives, which is enough to kill Whitley once and for all. Leaving Antarctica, it turns out the pilot is none other than Macready, who unlike Childs somehow managed to survive the ending of the original film.
Excellent timing there, pilot. Early retirement from Gen Inc.?
No, not exactly. On my way back from an extended Arctic vacation.
Uh-huh. So what's your name, smartass?
Macready. R.J. Macready. U.S. Outpost 131.
I said that I hate the Thing's story, and that's mostly down to the shoehorned elements that emerge once you start exploring secret underground labs. The more mastery over the Thing humans have, being able to keep it at bay, at least temporarily while they study it, the less scary it becomes. The Thing is meant to be an uncontrollable force of nature which hides in the shadows until it decides the time is right to reveal itself and cause chaos, not a conquerable specimen to be studied. I wonder whether Computer Artworks were fans of Resident Evil and the Umbrella Corporation's experiments with various viruses, as its own tale definitely has shades of Capcom's work. It's disappointing, as up until you enter the Pyron facility relatively early on, the story is solid. After that, and it's worth bearing in mind the crazy number of enemies you face doesn't help with this, a lot of the feelings of paranoia and mistrust begin to disappear, replaced by action and a somewhat generic "the government isn't the good guy and is secretly working on a weapon" storyline. Some of the individual character moments are decent too, Pierce offing himself, meeting Faraday and the like, and Blake is more emotive than expected from your generic soldier archetype, but it's not enough to save a title which ultimately lives and dies by its overarching story. There is a lot of lore too, in the form of various emails and notes you find throughout, but again, they also wear away much of the mystique surrounding the Thing, which is not a good thing in my eyes. The game's ending is a missed opportunity too. Macready seems to be alive and well, and together with Blake the pair live to fight another day, but we aren't given a whole lot of detail regarding Macready's survival, which is very strange considering the title was billed as a direct sequel to the 1982 story. How did he survive? It's something Childs didn't manage. What was he up to prior to the events of the game and during them? Could he still be the Thing? I'd have loved a more ambiguous ending than the one we're given, with a portion of Macready's clothing being visibly ripped, or something else clever I can't think of. A little tease that carries with it the suggestion that maybe the Thing did get its hands on everyone's favourite character in the end. When all is said and done, the rest of the Thing is very much like its ending. It's fine, it's okay, it's interesting enough, it's nothing to write home about. There are a ton of ideas with a lot of potential, the squad, trust and fear mechanics and the blood testing for example, and the references to the 1982 film prove Computer Artworks clearly held the film in high regard. A sequel to the game was being worked on, which according to developers interviewed since, intended to fix a lot of the game's issues, and it's such a shame it never ended up being released, because there was a lot to build on. However, one can only judge a game based on what it ends up being, well mostly anyway, and with the Thing being so tonally disparate from its source material after its first third and relying so much on action, it never comes close to being the cohesive product it perhaps could have been. Plus, it has two of the worst levels I've played in any video game ever, especially the one towards the end. They are abject affairs which drove me to the brink of despair. If you're someone who isn't a fan of the film or has little interest in it, the Thing can most definitely be skipped. The frustration just isn't worth the very occasional bright spot. If you're a huge fan of the film, or even films, you might find enough there that you do have an enjoyable experience. Even then, though, getting through it is going to be a struggle of monstrous proportions. Thanks for watching the video, boys, girls and soldiers stranded in the snow with a shape-shifting alien. If you enjoyed it, do think about liking, subscribing and sharing your thoughts. And all's well, we'll catch up again soon.